Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another session of Northeastern at Noon. And if you're a little bit like me, over the decades I've noticed that every time there's a presidential election, quite often I'll start thinking, gee, are we really doing this right? And it sort of reminds me of something that H.L. Mencken once said. He was a very popular reporter and commentator the first half of the 20th century. And he remarked one time that if you want to know what's wrong with America, just spend 5 minutes talking to the average American voter. Well, that seemed a little depressing, and eventually I came across something that Winston Churchill once said. You can always count on the Americans to do the right thing, but only after they've tried every possible wrong thing. Well, I thought that was a little bit more encouraging, but I think the real answer is probably it's halfway between the two. We're not still going through all the wrong ways. We may be closer to determining the right way sooner than we think. In any case, we're very happy and privileged to have with us today someone who can shed some light on how we choose our candidates. And that presenter is Professor William Mayer. A couple of his recent awards and activities been the Fulbright Distinguished Scholar Award in American Studies in 2022 at Tovos Lorand University. Now, this university is in Budapest, Hungary, and I'm told that it is one of the largest and most prestigious public higher education institution in Hungary. Additionally, he's won an award for a peer-reviewed journal article entitled, won the Best Paper Award, American Political Science Association, section on political organization and parties, and that was in 2011. There was an article he published in a peer-reviewed journal that I thought was a very interesting read. I'd like to see it sometime. This was in, actually, I already told you about that. So you could tell I was really impressed with it. He also served as secretary to the political forecasting group of the American Political Science Association for a couple of years in the teens, 2000s. I can really relate to that because for about 10 years I served as secretary to one of our city's commissions. And well, I was great at taking notes during the meeting, but reading those notes afterwards, that was a real chore. Now, he's also had some publications I think would make interesting reads. That is the most recent one, The Elephant in the Room, Donald Trump and the Future of the Republican Party. That was published a couple of years ago in 22. Another interesting one would be The Uses and Misuses of Politics, Karl Rove and the Bush Presidency. That was published by the University Press of Kansas back in 21. Finally, there is another book called In Pursuit of the White House, 2000, How We Choose Our Presidential Nominees. And that was published by Chatham House. And lastly, an article in a peer-reviewed journal called In Defense of Negative Campaigning. I always wondered about negative campaigning. It sort of gave me the impression that the candidate was saying, I'm really bad, but I'm better than the other person. But anyway, those of you who are familiar with my introductions will note that when we have someone as a presenter who's on the teaching faculty, I always like to check, if I can, with a website called ratemyprofessor.com. So I looked at some recent comments over the past 2 years, and I'll give you 3 of them. First one is very knowledgeable, lectures well, and provides real-world examples for everything. Another one is Professor Mayer is an amazing lecturer. He is interesting and great at structuring information that helps when studying for his exams. I always love those professors who gave you a heads up on what was on the exam. So thank you for doing that. Finally, here's some interesting comments. Professor Mayer is adorable and so knowledgeable. Yes, I was trying to skip over that a little bit. Professor Mayer is adorable and so knowledgeable on what he teaches. Incidentally, so knowledgeable, so is capitalized. I have now taken 2 classes with him and intend on taking more classes if I can. If you show up to class and take notes, you will get an A fairly easily. He is a clear lecturer, interesting to listen to, and he is really nice and accommodating. I like professors who are approachable because I have to admit, as some of you may have been, sometimes totally snowed in a class, so much so that I really don't know what I don't know, so I can't approach the professor and ask a question that makes any sense. So a professor who can work with you a little bit is really helpful. Well, what does all this mean? What is the bottom line? Well, I think we're all ready for a very interesting and informative presentation today. So without further delay, let's give a warm Northeastern at Noon welcome to Professor William Mayer.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for inviting me again. Part of what I was asked to do was to talk about the 2024, what's going to happen, and the short answer is I don't know. I'm not sure anybody does, except that everything's going to be close. As you may know, the Republicans currently have an 8-seat majority in the House of Representatives. And if I had to guess, I would guess that they will maintain that, maybe increase it a little bit. But that's about, I don't expect a big change in the House. The Senate, the Democrats currently have a majority. A few weeks ago, I would have predicted that the Republicans would win enough seats to gain a majority in the Senate. Many of the races have tightened up since then, so I'm not sure I've got a guess on that one. And of course, the presidential election, if you have paid any attention, you know is going to be very close. Kamala Harris has, if you average out a lot of the polls are kind of up and down. She has a little bit of a lead. If you average them out, she seems to have a little lead in the national popular vote. Some of the, and I'll talk about this in a second, some of the state polls, which are incidentally often not very reliable, but a lot of the state polls seem to suggest that in the very close battleground states that Trump has a little bit of a lead. So that may mean that the Electoral College is going to be important and possibly very controversial again this year. So I thought that I would spend a lot of today talking about the Electoral College, about how it works, about why the framers in the Constitution chose this, and whether in the end it's good or bad, and if you think it's bad, what we might do in place of it. And for the first time in my lectures at NU at noon, I actually have a handout here. And maybe I can get, excuse me, somebody to help pass these out. What you will see when you get this handout is that it is the text of Article 2, Section 1 in the Constitution. Just for a little bit of background, for the benefit of anybody who hasn't taken who need a historical refresher, because I'm guessing most of you haven't taken a class in American history in a few years. The U.S. Constitution was written by what we call today the Constitutional Convention, which was held in Philadelphia between May 25th and September 17th, which is why today you may know that September 17th is called Constitution Day, and every university in the country is given a little bit of money to host a speaker or something like that. Every state was invited to send delegates to the Constitutional Convention. The delegates were appointed by the state legislatures, and every state did send delegates except Rhode Island. Rhode Island was a sort of, if you wanted to talk about the worst things that went on in state government back in 1787, you talked about Rhode Island usually. So 74 delegates were appointed, but only 55 of them showed up at all, and many showed up and then left. An interesting example of one of these kind of intermittent attendees was Alexander Hamilton, star of stage and screen these days. He was a delegate from New York. A couple of weeks, into the proceedings, he gave a long speech outlining his own beliefs about what the national government should look like, and proposed a system. The most notable feature of his plan of government was that we would elect a president for life, much like Supreme Court justices are appointed. Well, no one else seems to have thought this was a good idea, so he left after a while and didn't come back until the very end. But anyway, they did ultimately put together a plan of government, and there was this very complicated system. I mean, if nothing else, you should get that from the sense that it's a long paragraph. But how does it work? Well, if you start at the provision near the top of the page, the one I have in boldface type, you'll note that every state gets a number of electors equal to the number of representatives and the number of senators it has in Congress. And this may be familiar to you because it's the same thing we do today. So, as a result of the 2020 census, Massachusetts currently has 9 members in the U.S. House of Representatives. Massachusetts, like every other state, has 2 senators. Add them together, and Massachusetts has 11 electoral votes. Let me see if I can, so I give you that. Now, when are these electors selected? Well, as the last of the bold-faced provision says, Congress has the power to determine the date on which the electors are chosen and the date on which they cast their ballots. Now, as you probably know, the electors, meaning the members of the Electoral College, are chosen on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. That's a week from today. What you probably don't know is the day on which the electors cast their ballots. That is established by law, by Congress, and it says that this will happen on the first Tuesday after the second Wednesday in December. So this year, it's going to be December 17th. And if you, on that day, the Massachusetts electors will meet, probably at the State House in Boston. I've always meant to attend one of those events to see if there's any kind of hoopla connected with it. In any event, they will probably, not to take the suspense out of it, but they'll probably cast their votes for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. So these electors, the members of the Electoral College, have a very important role. It's their votes that determine who becomes president. So that raises a very important question. How are the electors, again, the members of the Electoral College, chosen? And as you can see in the first, the remaining section that I've highlighted, the Constitution really leaves this up to state governments. In particular, it says nothing about a national popular vote. And as I say up here on the slide, in the beginning, in the first few presidential elections, the states took advantage of this and selected their members of the Electoral College in a variety of ways. In 1789, 3 states actually allowed the state legislatures to do it. 4 states allowed the voters to do it. 2 states used a mixed method in which the voters chose a number of candidates, but then the final choice was made by the state legislatures. And there was 1 state that actually allowed the governor to do it. It wasn't until the 1830s that almost all the states decided that the proper way to do this was to let the voters elect them. And of course, that's universally the case today. Now, the other thing that you might have noticed about the provisions in the Constitution is that the presidential electors were required to cast 2 presidential votes. Note, not 1 vote for president and 1 vote for vice president, not 1 vote which was designated to be your first choice and a second which was designed to be your second choice, 2 undifferentiated votes for presidential, for president. Now, why put such a strange provision in the Constitution? And the answer is that the members of the Constitutional Convention, the men who wrote the Constitution, thought that the presidential electors would be a very parochial group, that they would all vote for somebody from their own home state. And so they gave every presidential elector 2 votes with the important stipulation that one of them had to be from a state outside of their own home state. So if you were an elector in South Carolina in 1789, you might have cast your first vote for Pierce Butler, who you probably have never heard of, but he was a senator from South Carolina and a member of the Constitutional Convention. So your first vote goes to Pierce Butler. But your second vote, you might have said, well, now I'll vote for Ralph Izard, because he was the other senator from South Carolina. But you can't, because you have to. So the thought was, okay, you'll throw one vote away on your on a home state favorite, but the second vote will be for a national figure, somebody like George Washington or John Adams or later on Thomas Jefferson. Well, bottom line was that this system never worked the way that they thought it would work. And whoops, I'm losing my slides here. And but this system never worked the way it was supposed to. It created a number of problems and one near constitutional crisis in 1800. So finally, they passed the 12th Amendment to the Constitution in 1804, and that established that instead of casting 2 presidential votes, you cast 1 vote for president and 1 vote for vice president. Now, why did they select this crazy sort of system? One other thing about the thing that I should mention is that there is no mention whatsoever in the text of the Constitution about political parties. It was widely hoped by the framers of the Constitution either that there would be no political parties, or if there were some, that they'd be kind of weak. They wouldn't have much effect on the way government was conducted. Well, in fact, in spite of the fact that the framers all thought parties were bad, they nevertheless created the first mass-based parties, so far as we know, in history. The 2 first parties which have sort of gone out of existence since then, were centered around 2 remarkable men in George Washington's cabinet. One of them was Alexander Hamilton, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, and his followers became what was called the Federalist Party. And the other party coalesced around Thomas Jefferson. They were called, well, at the time they were called the Republican Party, but they're not the same as the Republican Party that's with us today. So historians often call them the Democratic Republican Party or the Jeffersonian Republican Party. In any event, they created parties for the simple reason that in an election, unity matters. If you have a race for representative, governor, president, and you've got, let's say, 3 Republican candidates and 1 Federalist candidate, the Federalist is likely to win because the votes for the Republican candidate are split among 3 candidates, whereas the Federalists have just 1. So the result was that, as I say, they created these parties, and they started making, how do you get unity? Well, you make nominations. And so that's what they did. They've done it in a number of different ways. From 1800 to 1824, presidential nominations were actually made by a party's members in Congress. It's called the Congressional Caucus. That's how Jefferson was nominated, and Madison and Monroe. From 1832 to 1908, the nominations were made by they were made by national conventions, and then the delegates were actually selected by state conventions. And as I say on the slide here, beginning in 1912, states started selecting their national convention delegates by presidential primaries. And of course, that's still the case. In fact, the use of presidential primaries has increased quite substantially since 1968, when the parties rewrote a lot of their rules. So that's the system. Now, why would anyone create such a crazy system for electing the president? And I think the best answer is that the Electoral College was seen as a kind of compromise between two other possibilities that were actually proposed at the Constitutional Convention. One of these proposals was to have the president elected by the members of Congress, just as, for example, the Prime Minister in Great Britain is elected by the members of Parliament. I should add that at this time in a lot of the states, the governor was selected by the members of the state legislature. It wasn't until some decades later that more and more states allowed the voters to elect the governor. This proposal to have the president elected by the members of Congress was initially well received in the Constitutional Convention, but over time, more and more delegates came to have a second thoughts about it. Why didn't they like having the Congress choose the president? Well, one reason was because it violated the separation of powers. The members of the convention all believed in the separation of powers, though they disagreed about exactly what it meant. But to have the members of the legislature elect the executive, everybody seemed to think that would violate the separation of powers. So that's something they weren't real wild about. The other reason is that they thought that they were very, very worried. This may, getting some music here. I don't know if, oh, I see. No, don't worry about it. I wondered if it was being broadcast over. Anyway, the framers were really worried about the possibility of corruption, which probably we're still worried about today. And they thought that the best, the way to kind of maximize the possibilities of corruption would be to gather all of the people who selected the president into one body, which of course was the way that if Congress elected the president, all of the members of Congress would be there. They thought that would leave it open to corruption. So the proposal to have the members of Congress elect the president gradually became less and less highly regarded over time. The other proposal that was at least proposed, the other method that was proposed, was to have the president elected by direct popular vote. And that proposal, one of the chief advocates of it was a guy from, well, at the time he was from Philadelphia. He later moved to New York. His name was Gouverneur Morris. And there were two occasions when the vote for president fell to the members of the Constitutional Convention, and it was voted down 9-0 and 8-1. So that wasn't very popular. Now, why didn't they like the idea of having a direct popular vote? Well, there's probably a number of reasons, but I think one of the biggest reasons was that they didn't think, well, one reason was they didn't trust the voters. That's the one that if you don't like American government, you often call attention to, and there's a couple of people who didn't. But I think the major reason that they didn't want a direct popular vote for president was that this was a huge new country, relatively speaking. I mean, much bigger than any other previous democracy. And there wasn't an easy method of national communication. You may know that, for example, when Andrew Jackson led Americans in the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, and the Americans won in a very lopsided vote. The news didn't get to Washington, D.C. until 2 months later. And so they didn't think that there was any way for the people in South Carolina to learn about candidates who might come from Massachusetts, or for the Massachusetts voters to learn about potential candidates in South Carolina or Georgia or wherever. So they compromised by creating this, what they really sort of thought was a compromise between the two. Under the Electoral College, the ordinary voters could have some impact on the selection of the president, either by voting for the members directly, which you remember they did in 4 states, or by electing the state legislators, who would in turn choose the members of the Electoral College. And since the electors would presumably be people who knew a little more about politics than the average voter, they wouldn't have quite as much trouble knowing about major presidential possibilities from other states. So that's why we have the system that we do. Now, is this a good system? Well, of course, there are arguments on both sides of the question. 2 major arguments in favor of the Electoral College. One, as I say here, is that it requires successful presidential candidates to assemble a broad geographic coalition. You can't get elected president just by piling up a lot of popular votes in California and New York, which Democrats often do these days. You have to, at least win, well, typically 1 or 2 southern states if you're a Democrat, maybe a state or 2 from the West, states from the Midwest, and so on. And the other argument is that it gives a bit more weight to small states, because remember that every state gets a number of electors equal to its number of representatives. So that's population-based. But then they also get 2 electors for having 2 senators. So again, states like Wyoming, Montana, New Hampshire, Vermont, all get a little more weight in the presidential selection process than they would if it were a pure popular vote system. Major argument against the Electoral College is that a candidate can get elected president even though his or her opponent wins more popular votes. Now, I used to say that this was a theoretical but not really practical possibility, because when I first got to Northeastern in the early 1990s, one could say that the last time somebody had been elected president even though his opponent won more popular votes was in 1888, when Grover Cleveland lost to Benjamin Harrison. But as you probably know, that's now happened 2 out of the last 6 presidential elections. and there's at least a reasonable chance that it'll happen again this year. The other criticism of the Electoral College is that it means that almost all of the campaigning occurs in a small number of what are called battleground states. So if you were to look at where the candidates are appearing in person, there's a fair amount of evidence that says that if you give a speech in Washington, D.C., well, you may get a little publicity. If you give a speech in Pennsylvania, okay, the national networks and the the Washington Post and the New York Times will cover it, but the Pennsylvania media will really cover it heavily. So if you were to look at a list of where the candidates are campaigning, they're campaigning overwhelmingly in a very small number of states: Pennsylvania, Ohio, Georgia, Arizona. Not Massachusetts, even though Massachusetts has, for example, more electoral votes than Arizona. Similarly, if you may have seen some political ads on television. The reason you have seen them, if you've seen them, is not that people are worried about winning Massachusetts. Everybody recognizes that Harris is going to win Massachusetts. The reason you might have seen an ad for either Trump or Harris is because New Hampshire is a battleground state. And it turns out that 2/3 of the New Hampshire voters actually live in the Boston media market. There is only one major television station in New Hampshire. It's WMUR. And so if you want to get the attention of a lot of the New Hampshire voters, you advertise on Boston TV. And so you've probably seen ads, and they're not trying to sway Massachusetts. They're aiming at New Hampshire. You may also have seen, I've seen certainly, a lot of ads for the New Hampshire governor's election, which is thought to be pretty close. And again, why would we see them if we live in Massachusetts? Well, because most of the New Hampshire electorate is in the Boston media market. So there really is, in some ways, a distorted campaign where lots of states, including states that have a lot of people in them, like California and New York and Texas, get ignored, and lots of other states get all the attention. Assuming you don't like the Electoral College, what might you do about it? Well, in some ways, the simplest thing to do would be to pass a constitutional amendment that requires that the president be elected by direct popular vote. Whoever gets the most votes gets elected president. No need for special presidential electors or anything else like that. Problem with that is that amending the Constitution is a difficult thing to do. As I say here, if you accept the first 10 amendments, which were kind of a touch-up job on the Constitution, since then, in 230 years since then, we've passed only 17 amendments. And the reason is that it's difficult to amend the Constitution, deliberately so. The framers did not want the Constitution to be amended for trivial or momentary reasons. And so they erected a pretty high bar for electing the president. An amendment first has to be approved by 2/3 of the members of both houses of Congress, and then it has to be ratified by either 3/4 of state legislatures or 3/4 of what are state conventions that are called by the states. Now, that would always have been a difficult thing to do. The members of Congress in small states and the state legislatures in small states would always have been reluctant to eliminate the Electoral College. But in addition, we now have another reason why it would be difficult to eliminate the Electoral College, and that is that by this point, there is a widespread belief that the Electoral College advantages Republicans. I mean, the last two candidates who got elected president without winning the Electoral College have both been Republicans. And that means that if you were to propose eliminating the Electoral College today, the majority of Republicans, I suspect, would vote against it. Not an easy thing to do. Another alternative is to change the way that states award their delegates based on the popular vote. At present, 48 states and the District of Columbia award their delegates on a winner-take-all basis, meaning that whoever gets the most votes gets all of the electoral votes from that state, no matter how close the actual vote was. So to take an example that really made this point, in 2000, you remember, George W. Bush won the state of Florida by 538 votes, popular votes, out of about 9 million cast. And yet he won all 25 of Florida's electoral votes. Was that fair to Al Gore? Well, you can go and say that George W. Bush won at least a fair number of votes in California and didn't get any electoral votes for his trouble. But the point I want to make now is that there's nothing in the Constitution that says you have to do it by winner take all. Two other possibilities. One is to award the members of the Electoral College on a proportional basis. So if you win 60% of the votes in a state like Florida, which again, I'm going back to the point when it had 25 electoral votes, it would have the person who got 60% of the vote would get 60% of the Electoral College votes from Florida, which would be 15. And the candidate who got 40% and would have been shut out if it was a winner-take-all would have gotten 40 electoral votes. That system is not used by any state today. It was used by a number of states way back when, but not anymore. The other way to have, alternative way to have the electoral votes awarded is by effectively holding a separate election in every congressional district. So in a state like Massachusetts, again, it has 9 members of Congress. If Harris wins the most votes in District 1, she gets 1 electoral vote. If Trump were to win a plurality in District 2, he gets 1 electoral vote. If Harris wins the rest, she gets 7 more electoral votes, and then whoever gets the most votes in a state gets 2 more electoral votes. And that system, as you may know, is actually used in 2 states today, Nebraska and Maine. But every state could adopt it if they want to. Problem is that there's very little likelihood, well, let me back up. The great advantage of awarding the electoral votes by either a proportional or a districted system is that it would give the candidates the incentive to campaign across the country. Because now, if if Trump gets 40% of the of the popular vote in California, he gets nothing for his troubles. So there's no point in his campaigning in California. If he were to if you use a proportional system and he goes from 40 to, let's say, 44% of the vote, he gets two more electors, two more electoral votes. So, as I say, the candidates would have the incentive to distribute their campaigning more widely. Unfortunately, there's very little likelihood that either of those systems would be adopted today. Why not? Because it basically helps the minority party. I mean, if Massachusetts were to adopt a proportional system, who would it help? The Republicans. But as you know, the state legislature and the governor are both Democrats. So there's no way they're going to adopt a system that helps the Republicans any more than the Republican legislature and governor are going to adopt a system like that in Texas because it favors the Democrats. So there's one other possibility here, and that is there is something out there called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact Plan. Now, how does that work? Well, the idea is you get as many states as possible to adopt a law that says if enough states adopt this law to add up to 270 electoral votes, every one of these states will award its electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote, regardless of what happened in that state. So if Texas were to adopt this plan and Trump wins a majority of the votes in Texas, but Harris wins across the country, then Texas would award its votes to Trump rather than Harris. And as I say here, 17 states in the District of Columbia, including Massachusetts, have actually adopted this law with a total of 209 electoral votes. So they need just 61, enough states to total 61 additional electoral votes to put this in place. It's kind of an end run around the Constitution, you might think. Getting that additional 61 may be a little tough. And there are some other questions about how it would exactly operate, and a number of critics maintain that this plan is unconstitutional. So the bottom line is that we're stuck with the Electoral College, at least for this election, and I suspect for quite a number of elections to come. This year, as I think I mentioned, Harris is at least narrowly ahead in the national polls, but Trump seems to be ahead in a number of states, a number of the battleground states. So it's, we may have another election where the person who loses the popular vote nevertheless gets elected president. Whether you think that's a good or a bad thing, of course, depends on your preferences. But in any event, at least it has affected, as I say, the campaigning by the two candidates. So I may have talked a little too long, but I will take questions or comments, and I gather this is only a 1 hour event, but I'll keep talking after that after they've turned off the, yeah.
So do any of the territories get electoral votes? Or
No.
So they vote, but it doesn't matter?
I mean, if they want to vote, they can, but it has no impact whatsoever on the actual election. They do actually get delegates at the national conventions, but not electoral votes. Anybody else? Yeah.
Do you think partisanship is likely to destroy our government? Because it seems more and more toxic every year that goes by.
I'm sorry, more and more states.
The partisanship, especially in Congress, seems to grow more toxic year by year, so that they're not nearly as interested in solving the country's problems as they are in, oh, we got to get a Republican win. Oh, this is going to make the Democrats look great. How about the United States of America?
The question is about the will partisanship play a big role in the coming in American government in the coming years, and the answer, I'm afraid, is yes. One of the other major trends in American politics that if you were to take classes at Northeastern in American government today, they would almost certainly talk a lot about this, is what's called polarization. And the point is that if you go back to the 1960s, most Democratic members of the House and Senate were liberal, but there were also some moderate Democrats, and from the South, a large number of conservative Democrats. And similarly, there were most of the senators and representatives on the Republican side were conservative, but there were a lot of moderate Republicans, and even a few liberal Republicans from states like Massachusetts. I think you're all old enough to remember the case of Ed Brooke, who was the first black senator elected to the U.S. Senate since the end of Reconstruction. He was a liberal Republican. Today, there is no way a candidate like that would get nominated by the local Republican Party. And similarly with, who gets nominated by the voters for the Senate or the House of Representatives in Massachusetts. Yes, partisanship will matter. Some of it is contrived in the sense that assume, let's say that Harris gets elected. One of the things you don't want to do if you are a Republican is vote for a lot of her proposals. And there's two reasons you don't want to do it. One is because you don't want to make her look good. When Ronald Reagan was able to get his tax and budget plans through Congress back in 1981 and do it with a whole lot of Democratic votes, it kind of established this aura around Reagan. He's a leader. He's inspirational. He can work even with members of the other party. Well, today you don't want to do that. If you are a Republican and Harris gets elected, or if you're a Democrat and Trump gets elected. The other reason you don't want to, if you're a Democrat, you don't want to help Harris. If you're a Democrat, you don't want to help Trump, is because a lot of the legislatures today in both parties are worried less about losing the general election than they are about losing the primary. So, Ed Markey, when he ran in, I think it was 2020, he won the general election with no trouble. I think he had 75% of the vote. The thing that gave him a little bit of sweat, a little bit of anxiety, was that Joseph P. Kennedy III, gave him a challenge for the Democratic nomination for the Senate. And, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did exactly that successfully. She campaigned against a longtime member of the House from New York, and she beat him in a very low turnout election, but she beat him, and she's been the representative there ever since. And as I say, that sends out a signal to a lot of Democrats in safe Democratic seats or Republicans in safe Republicans seats. Watch your flank. Watch. Don't say anything very nice about. If you're a Democrat, don't say anything nice about Harris because you may lose in the primary 2 years on down. So I'm afraid, yes, we're stuck with a very partisan system for the coming years. Yeah.
Could you address redistricting, that may not be the exact term, in reference to the Electoral College and why it's legal, or is it partially legal?
She asked about the question of redistricting. Can I keep going here? Or should I? I got 2 minutes. Okay. Redistricting is what the first thing that happens every 10 years is that they do the census, and on the basis of the census, they tell every state how many members of Congress it has. That is a purely mathematical exercise. There's no discretion involved. Where there is a lot of discretion is, okay, Massachusetts has 9 members in the House of Representatives. It is not specified in the Constitution, but it is specified in federal law that what Massachusetts now has to do is divide the state into 9 congressional districts, each of which will elect 1 member of Congress. And that set of decisions, redistricting, is a very political, in the largely negative sense, decision. What do states take into account? Well, one thing they have to take into account, the Supreme Court has insisted on this, is that every district have an equal number of residents. Note, not an equal number of votes, an equal number of residents. So if you have a district in California that has, well, typical district these days has about 800,000 residents, and half of them are non-citizens, doesn't matter. So the Supreme Court has mandated that they have an equal number of residents. Second thing that the exact dimensions of this are a little bit murky, but you cannot intentionally discriminate on the basis of race. So at one point, down in the South particularly, they would draw the districts so that they would try as much as possible to make sure that no district had a majority of black voters. So that way you'd elect nothing but whites. Well, the Supreme Court said that was unconstitutional. Then, for a long time, a lot of states drew what were called majority-minority districts, in which they intentionally tried to construct these very awkwardly shaped districts just so that they had a majority of black residents and therefore a majority of black voters. Supreme Court in the 1990s said that's unconstitutional. So, you can't do one or the other, you're somewhere in the middle. What the Supreme Court has never said is that you can't divide, you can't draw your districts on the basis of partisanship. And so if you have a state like Massachusetts that has the legislatures controlled by one party and the governor controlled by that party, they will draw the lines so that, so far as they can tell, every district has a majority of Democrats. They could probably draw at least one district on the South Shore and part of the Cape that would have a majority of Republicans, but they don't want to do that. So they kind of split the Republican areas around among 3 different districts, each of which has a majority of Republicans. I'm sorry, each of which has a majority of Democrats. And in other states, like Texas, there are enough Democrats in Texas that you can't completely deny them a seat in the in Congress. So what you do is you create these districts that are overwhelmingly Democratic. And of course, the point is that if a Democratic candidate wins a congressional election by, say, 80% of the vote, 30% of those votes, or 29%, are wasted, in a sense, because all he needed was 51% to win. So it's called packing and stacking. You pack districts overwhelmingly for one party, and then the other party has a narrower but still comfortable majority in the other districts. Is that clear enough? I may not be explaining that very well because I'm about to be reminded that I've gone over. But I will stay and answer any other questions. I apologize if I went a little long in talking about the Electoral College. Take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. Your lectures lived up to our expectations and predictions from the comments on the website. Please accept this token of appreciation. Please don't consider it as a bribe to come back, but it is anyway.
I'd love to come back. I have always enjoyed these, and thank you for inviting me.